Bertrand Russell was a well-known English philosopher and mathematician, and he taught in some of the finer universities in England during his time. In one of his philosophy classes, they were discussing reality, is this all there is? The really ultimate question. And so Professor Russell then asked his students, how is it that the Earth is suspended in space? How can that be? And of course, the traditional answer then, as it would be now, is that those gravitational forces and the subatomic particles and the atoms that comprise the universe are all part of a much bigger whole, even though that we don't see it. A student troubled by this answer raises her hand, and she goes, I don't believe that's how the Earth is being held up. And so he asked her, well, how is it that the Earth is being held up in the universe? And she rather quickly said, the Earth is resting on the back of a very large turtle. He had never heard that answer before, so he inquired about this turtle. He said, well, given your hypothesis, the turtle has to be standing on something. What would that be? And she said rather quickly, once again, the back of another very large turtle. So then, rather irritated, Professor Russell then pushed and said, it's an order of science that there must be a foundation. Atoms and subatomic particles are how we explain that. How do you explain the foundation of your tower of turtles? And she looks to him and says, it's just turtles, all the way down. This story, which is actually a true story, is an endemic of how secular world looks at things. They don't say it's turtles all the way down. I think they're kind of willing to buy into the subatomic particle and the particle theory, but that the reality that is present in the universe is all there is. And since it is all there is really no room for a God whom we've invented, nor is there something after our life ends, because this is all there is. Naturally, persons of faith take a wholly different perspective. Their answer to Professor Russell's question would be, God who created the heavens and the earth, created them so that the planets would be suspended in their proper orbits, that is the foundation that holds all creation together. So I think the seminal question is this all there is? For believers, this is not all there is. In fact, if you ask a believer, what is all there is, the only answer is God, who is all there is. We're made in his image and likeness, and one day he will bring us to be like him, and that's why we have a basis for believing in an afterlife. This wonderful idea is embraced in two of our readings this weekend. The first reading from the Maccabees. The Maccabees were a rather zealous group of Jews when the Promised Land was under heavy attack and ultimately occupation about 150 years before the birth of Christ. Lots of violence, and many Jews were forced to give up their religion, and they did so that they could live in peace. The conquerors insisted on it. The Maccabees refused to violate any of the Jewish rules, and also became prominent defenders till they all died, literally. They had to be wiped out. So we get a story of an example of that in our first reading this morning. There are 7 brothers, and they're being ordered to eat pork. The idea is to disdain their religion, or they will be put to a cruel death. And of course, as you heard the story, brother after brother refuses to do the simple task they ask and permits the violence that happens to their bodies. Their executioners had to be dumbfounded. How foolish, how irrational that you would give yourself, your life away, and will get nothing in return. It's the only way they could see it. But the Maccabees' testimony sounds differently. They know they're giving this life away, but they know they're going to gain something better, life in the world to come. You see, this they believed, and as a result of their belief, they could handle the disappointment of the death in this life. Secular thinking has no answer to that. All it can say is this is all there is, and it's unfortunate. When it is that we pass and move on, there's simply nothing left. The second reading is our gospel reading. The Sadducees, who are going to question Jesus, are really trying to trick him, which is typical of both the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The thing that makes the Sadducees different than the Pharisees was a religious belief. The Pharisees believed in some form of an afterlife. Sadducees did not. They thought the idea of resurrection was ridiculous. And so they posed this hypothetical question. to Jesus about 7 brothers and a woman, and the idea that the first brother marries the woman, and he dies, and she's still childless, and so the obligation of the other brothers is to marry and produce children. As the story develops, all 7 of the brothers die, then the woman dies, and there aren't any children. And so they ask him, who will be the husband of this woman in the new life? That's why they were ridiculing the idea of resurrection. Of course, Jesus, ready for this, says back to them what they don't expect. He says, only in this age do people marry and remarry. In the life to come, there is not marriage. There is not all those institutions, and therefore all can be one. Lest some of you get the idea that this means that you're not going to be with your spouse in heaven, which may be good or bad news, whatever the case may be. That's not the intent of this story or the intent of that question. But what we do in this life to forge our relationships lays the blueprint for the life that is to come. Everything is in preparation for that, our heavenly perfected existence. And so once again, that dilemma is laid before us. Is this all there is, or is God all there is? We gathered together this morning, an extra hour of sleep from last night, to celebrate the Eucharist. And every time we celebrate the Eucharist, it's an intentional gathering of people. In order for the Eucharist to be properly celebrated, there has to be a priest and there has to be a group of people that are willing to come. And so each of us, for what our various reasons might be, I knew my reason, my goodness, I'm supposed to, but the various reasons that we might have, we gather as an intentional group of people. Sometimes we know each other, sometimes we don't know each other. The common thread that unites us all is that we ask that question, is this all there is? To be reminded that God is all there is and something better awaits us. And to gather together as a company of sinners. It's the one thing that holds a church population together. They are intentionally aware of our own sinfulness. And as a result, we find solidarity in others who also struggle with their own sins. And it's the gathering of the Eucharistic body, then, that allows the sacrament to have its fullness. Because basically, in the sacrament, a gift is given to us by God. And the gift of the Eucharist, which is, of course, God's action, not mine and not yours. God's action is a divine action, which means it comes from heaven. It means it comes from the life that is to come. It means it comes from God who is all there is. And that condenses into a simple, lovely, elegant thought that when you and I receive Holy Communion, for that matter, any one of the sacraments, we receive the fullness and entirety and eternalness of God who is all there is. Something insignificant isn't happening in the communion line. Something routine isn't happening in the communion line. Something miraculous and extraordinary happens every time we're in the communion line because we are reminded this is not all there is by receiving something that is all there is. And it's that promise of an eternal life that gives us the ability to withstand the difficulties, the sufferings, and the trials and tribulations that we experience in this life. I was reading one of my favorite theologians a few weeks ago and came across this passage, and Gerard Lofink is his name, and I wanted to share it with you because I think it frames the idea that I'm preaching this morning. What a Christian expects after death is not a completely different life, but the perfection of what she or he is now already doing and experiencing in life with and for others out of faith in Jesus Christ. It is the perfection of being Christ's disciple and being made like him. That idea of perfection is elusive to us. We know that it's actually a mental disease to be a perfectionist. It turns out you make things worse when you're trying to do that. And then we may tell ourselves perfection is an ideal, it's an idea, it's a theory, but it's not real. Christian teaching teaches us differently. God, who is all there is perfect, so perfection is real. And when God gives himself fully to us in sacrament, which he does this morning, that is also real perfection. When we are touched by real perfection, we become also really perfect. We remind ourselves that this is the process. The imperfect life we're living now will become perfection. Maybe I can better illustrate this by a rather famous family story now in my family. When I was much younger, my great Aunt Jeanette was one of the many great aunts that we had. And Aunt Jeanette was in her 70s and basically didn't really like a lot of noise or confusion. So when my family and my cousins also came to my grandparents' house, a tiny little house on Alfred Street in Portland, there were all these people under one roof, and of course there were 10 kids, so you naturally know it was complete rebellion, whatever was going on, and it just drove her crazy. She's not used to being around all that noise, and she was constantly snarling and making faces. You know, we were kids, so we just completely were afraid of her. I mean, she thought she like the Wicked Witch of the West, or the one that Hansel and Gretel in that one. We always had that notion of her. Well, ultimately, Aunt Jeanette died, and I was about 11 years old, and we went to her funeral. It was the second family funeral I'd ever been to. And they were there, and we gathered in the funeral home with our parents, and all these people were there. And as you know, when you're kids and you're around your parents in a kind of different situation, you stick to them, and you're paying attention to what they're saying. Parents frequently do not realize children have radar ears, and they're going to hear things that you don't think they're going to hear, particularly if you talk a little softer, because then they'll just listen that much more attentively. Something good's being said. Mother said to my dad, she said, "I'm so surprised so many people have come to see Jeanette," and without skipping a beat, my dad said back to her, "They're coming to make sure she's really dead." I waited till my grandmother's funeral in 2004 to tell that story to my family that was assembled together and the other mourners that had come to that liturgy. It was really touching. So the way I described it is that Aunt Jeanette is now perfected in heaven. And I said my grandmother was meeting her, that was her cousin, meeting her cousin. She understood in a totally different way than we did. And she is seeing her perfected. And Aunt Jeanette is seeing grandmother perfected as well. They're seeing something, the fullness that they've never seen before, but they've seen evidence of it. Very touching. And it did what every preacher's real goal is in a good funeral homily: get enough people to cry, to actually emote and experience that. Now, if I do say so myself, it was pretty good. At the end of the funeral, my dad came up to me. He would always have some quip to make. But this time he was being really genuine. And his eyes had little tears in them, and he just thought that was wonderful what I did, and talking about the family. And then he became my dad. He looked at me and he said, "But the part about Aunt Jeanette being perfect in heaven, that's a bridge too far." So it's taken some time for this to root in my family, and she's mentioned at every family funeral that I carry, but this idea that we'll be perfected. You see, we operate with raw material in this life. Our friends, our spouses, our children, we know a lot about them, but there's a lot that we don't know and a lot that we don't understand. And often conflict emerges as a result of it. Sometimes it's simple conflict, sometimes it's not so simple conflict. And we basically experience so many things in our life as being unresolved. That's why death is such a difficult thing for us. When a person dies, we now cannot resolve whatever conflict we felt was left. Many people feel burdened and guilty by it. But what a wonderful notion that when we see each other in heaven, we will see each other perfected. And all of that conflict, all of that misunderstanding, all of that sadness will be gone with the wind. There's a song that I've heard that I used on All Saints' Day that I'm going to use it again this weekend that I think concretely illustrates this idea of the afterlife. Left without concrete illustration, and it is an illustration, we get this idea that heaven is this abstract place where everybody's happy, and it's really hard to relate to it. But the minute we begin to relate to seeing the people that we know and seeing them perfected, I think heaven takes on a really beautiful meaning. The song is called My Heaven, and it was sung by Mary Chapin Carpenter, one of my very favorite artists. It goes this way. Nothing shatters, nothing breaks, nothing hurts, and nothing aches. We've got ourselves one hell of a place in my heaven. Looking down at the world below, a bunch of whining and fighting schmoes. Up here, we've got none of those in my heaven. There's pools and lakes and hills and mountains, music, art, and lighted fountains. Who need bucks here? No one's counting in my heaven. No one works, we all just play. You can pick the weather every day. And if you change your mind, that's okay in my heaven. Grandma's up here, Grandpa too, in a condo with to die for views. There's presidents and movie stars. You just come as you are. No one's lost and no one's missing. No more parting, just hugs and kissing. And all these stars are just for wishing in my heaven. There's little white lights everywhere. Your childhood dog in Dad's old chair. And more memories than my heart can hold when Eva's singing Fields of Gold. There's neighbors, thieves, and long-lost lovers, villains, poets, kings, and mothers. Up here, we forgive each other in my heaven. For every soul that's down here waiting, holding on, still hesitating, we say a prayer while levitating in my heaven. You can look back on your life and lot, but it can't matter what you're not. By the time you're here, we're all we've got in my heaven. I agree that these notions, which are just imaginations, can seem like fantasy. You may not know this, but the most popular fiction category, more books in this category about than anything else in the fiction universe, are romance novels. And there's a gazillion of them. And they are prolific. They're being produced on a daily basis. And they follow an essential grid, basically. The two people meet, they fall in love, and then there's complications, but in the end, they come together. There's no point in writing a romance novel that has a sad ending. It's not a romance novel. In fact, if you go through Amazon and start looking, you'll see when the novels are out, there's a million of them, I'll tell you that right now. They'll put on there what they call trigger warnings. There may be angst, like how could there not be angst, right? Or sadness or divorce. Some of the things are just mentioned as trigger warnings in the book, but every one of them will say, but you had a guaranteed HEA, which means guaranteed happily ever after. Well, that's easy to dismiss that. That's a romance novel. It's an imagination. It's a fantasy. And that's where those who are not believers have trouble with what I'm talking about this morning. To them, it only sounds like a fantasy and nothing else. But you see, this is not all there is. God is all there is. And he revealed to us, by talking about the afterlife to the Sadducees, that there is something more, and that something more is greater. And in that greater one, you and I will be reunited with the people we've loved and lost, and we will see them in a way we've never seen them before, and they will see us in a way they've never seen us before, perfected. It's not a romance novel, but it's a happily ever after, guaranteed.